My name is Jessica Allen. I am the city planner. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight in these waning days of summer and dedicating some time here to the city and helping us complete this project. This is the Complete Streets meeting. Make sure you're in the right spot. You're not supposed to be somewhere else. This has been a collaborative project between the Planning Department and Department of Public Works. We have Joe Kuczynski, who is our fearless leader at DPW. We have Dan Murphy, who's our city engineer, and we have a couple folks from VHB, I'm just going to say the two Matts, that are going to be giving the meat of the presentation. But just to sort of give you a sense of how we got here, Complete Streets is a designing engineering concept that kind of came into a little bit more common urban design language about 5 years ago. A complete street is looking at designing streets not just for cars, but looking at all the different modes of transportation that might be using a street, whether you're walking, whether you're on a bike, whether you're using transit, and for all ages and abilities. So whether you're in a baby stroller or whether you're in a wheelchair, whether you don't have any mobility issues, whether you're deaf or blind, this is making sure that streets are designed in such a way that no matter what mode of transportation and no matter who you are, you have the ability to walk or ride on a street safely, getting from point A to point B. And that was really a huge shift in engineering concepts not that long ago, to really start thinking about how do we make our streets more walkable, how do we make them more friendly for bikes, so that in my world, I'm looking at how it impacts economics. How are we going to revitalize downtown? How are we going to make sure we've got people downtown? It's not just about the transportation, but how it impacts a community's character. So taking that basic concept, the city adopted an administrative policy in May 2016 that was a complete streets policy, which basically the city is saying, we're making a commitment to start considering all of our new street infrastructure projects to take this concept of complete streets and designing so that, if feasible, if there's enough space, if it makes sense, if we can make it work, we're going to make sure our roads projects are not just for cars, but are for bikes, for transit, for walkers, for anybody who's going to be on the street. So that was a big first step for us to take. And the state has, they have a complete streets program that is about maybe 2 years old, I think, at this point, maybe going on 3. And for communities that have adopted a complete streets policy, for communities that have gone through this process of prioritizing all of the different infrastructure projects in their community that could have some amendments, some changes to make them more of a complete street, there's funding available. Of course, the state with their carrot. There's money here at the end of the road. No pun intended. So the state is offering annually around $400,000 to communities to do infrastructure projects, which sounds like it's a whole bunch of money, but in all actuality, when it comes to streets projects, $400,000 is not that much. It's a little bit of a drop in the bucket. So, so a lot of the projects that you'll hear about tonight are not the big, flashy overhauls. These are going to be more of the connector projects, the sidewalk improvements, making things ADA compliant. These are sort of the smaller projects that might get lost in the bigger picture because there's just not enough money to go around and do everything. The state is now dedicating this pot of money to do those types of projects to make our streets more walkable, more bike friendly. So that's where we're at. Did I leave anything out, Joe? Okay. I'm going to turn it over to VHB. They're going to give the complete picture, a Complete Streets 101. What does that mean? The state program a little bit, and then they're going to get into a little bit of how we prioritize these projects. 100 projects is a lot of projects for us to come up with. And so there's got to be some weighting measure of how these are, what was the analysis that got us to this list. And then we're going to open it up, and we've got maps around, and we're going to ask people to break into small groups and start looking at these maps and start identifying and seeing the stuff that you have in your head from your neighborhood or where you walk on a daily basis or ride your bike on a daily basis. The problems that you see when you're out in the streets, are those projects on this list? And that's really kind of what we want to get to, because once we get this complete list, we're going to be sending it to the state, and then they'll start to allow us to apply for funding based on this list. So if the project's going to get funded, it's got to be on the list. So that's where we're at tonight. I'm going to turn it over to VHB.
Go ahead. Just have one thing. The design is, the cost of the design is something that the city has to pick up.
Correct.
It's only, the $400,000 is only for construction only.
Correct.
So any projects that, before they can even start, have to be designed, we need to foot the bill for them.
Correct. Correct. So some of these projects we're looking at are smaller design capacity to them, things that we can just do right off the bat. So, okay, turning it over now.
Great, thank you. Well, my name is Matt Soltis. I'm with VHB, and I'm also here with Matt Chase. And so I'm going to go into a little bit what Complete Street is, kind of what all these boards and pictures are around the room, and kind of how we came up with a project list and kind of how we evaluated that. So ideally, a complete street would accommodate all modes of transportation, so transit, bike, pedestrian, and vehicular traffic. So ideally, you would accommodate all 4 modes, but we kind of looked around the city, see what's out there based on existing data. We looked at reports from local planning commissions. We looked at existing data, environmental concerns, and tried to evaluate these streets, look at them briefly and kind of see what we did. The boards we have around the room, we have a bunch of different things. We have ones with sidewalks and shows that there's a sidewalk on one side of the road, 2 sides of the road. We have ones with roadway speed limits. We have ones with traffic volumes and accident locations. We have ones with environmental conditions and all kind of key factors that factor into how easily you could more or less implement a project. So piggyback on Jessica too, for Mass DOT, Phase 1 was implement a citywide policy. Phase 2 is what we're doing right now, is come up with a project list and submit that to DOT, and DOT will then in the end give funding, and then Phase 3 would be implementation of that project. So came up with a bunch of different projects. We looked at existing planning studies, we came up with these graphics, we did some gap analysis around town, we looked at traffic counts, we looked at where people are trying to go in town, and realized, you know, biggest area is downtown. People, a lot of bike users using the Manhattan Rail Trail, using that to access the downtown, access the neighborhoods, and we really looked at how we could bring people to utilize that and the public streets to access more stuff in town. We also looked at connections on where could we bring these sidewalks, bikes to key nodes in town, such as City Hall, schools, businesses, parks, a bunch of different things that we looked at where ADA is lacking in the town, maybe some improvements, some crosswalks, and some safety enhancements. Do the roadways even need to be repaired? So we looked at a bunch of different items, some of the things like traffic volumes, you know, is there pedestrian bike activity out there now? Has there been, you know, fatality? Has there been a lot of crashes? All those factors kind of implement projects and looking at gaps. And then we kind of worked with the town, developed a bunch of projects. We have over 100 projects right now, you'll see on the list, and the plans that are on the tables are all kind of numbered with a little dot, and each dot is kind of corresponds to a project on the project list, and they're either a pedestrian project, a bike project. So what we're trying to do after this is really get feedback from you guys and kind of what you guys think are important projects, and really we can add more projects to the list and re-rank different projects and how we want to do that. So after this, break down these groups, we can go over different projects, discuss what your guys' concern is and how we can make the Complete Streets program successful. I think that's really it right now, unless Matt has anything else you want to
touch on a few things.
We break out.
So it's not like we came about this list overnight. We worked closely with planning, engineering, and a lot of other studies that were done in town. We have a pretty detailed ranking matrix that we've developed that uses all the information from these boards that you'll see, where we incorporate traffic volumes, crash data. Keep in mind that you might see a project on this list that you might say, this is the highest priority, we definitely need to have this project, we need to get it done. But a lot of things that we considered was, is there the right of way? Is there enough room to build this project without having to purchase property, try to get easements? And one of the things that this program is all about is about readiness. How, picking projects that are easy to implement, that don't need a lot of environmental permitting, that don't need a lot of construction, their constructability is easy, and we don't need a lot of right-of-way and those sort of things. That's not to say that we didn't include those projects on this list. They are on that list, but we kind of used this ranking matrix and developed kind of a list of criteria that we evaluated every project and looked at it from these different criteria, so that we could come up with a list of projects that would be easy to implement within the budget that is available with DOT and in a short period of time. Or there's other projects where the town is going to be or the city is going to be pursuing through their paving projects. What can we piggyback as part of Complete Streets with the paving projects, where we can go through and might require a little more right-of-way or environmental, might a little more legwork that goes with it. So the goal of this project is that while we're creating a list for Complete Streets and for the DOT, we're also looking bigger picture. We're creating a list of projects that are for Complete Streets, but also things that are priorities for the town. So while you might see some of these projects here, and some of them might be too costly to get through the Complete Streets process, for example, Union Street. We're working with the city now to redo Union Street, but that's part of a state project that's being funded through the state TIP. I know there'll probably be some discussion about that today. People will probably have thoughts on that, and we're welcome to get some thoughts on that, but not get tied up to that, because we'll have a separate meeting with that later on that project. And that project it's too expensive, so to speak, for Complete Streets. So just keep that in mind, that we're looking from the little projects that are easy to fund and implement, where I think the city can go and bid something that doesn't require a lot of extra design work and more money to implement or to create the planning, the documents and the bid documents that go with it. But anything and everything from transit shelters, speed limit sign, speed ahead signs, sidewalks, ADA ramps, bike lanes, sharrows. There's going to be some instances where everybody says, I want bike lanes on this roadway, but we can't get bike lanes on that roadway because we might have to widen 5-6 feet, and you need right of way, and it's just either not feasible or meet the character of a low volume roadway. So things like that, we'll have productive discussions when we break out into these groups. There's a good amount of folks here, so maybe 10 people or so, 8 to 10 people at each of these. There's 2 up here and 2 over here. And I think we can break out into those groups and have a discussion about any projects that you think need to be on the list, that maybe they're there already, and just have a good discussion and get some feedback from you. That's what we're here today, to get feedback from you, to gain an understanding of what concerns you have. The project list that we have is not final. This is a living document. It's going to continuously be updated from this point through Dan's career. So it's not, this is the final. This is something that's going to continue to be work. And if there's any questions that come up after this meeting, you can feel free to reach out. I have my business cards here. I can give it to you, or you can reach out to Dan or Joe at any time to say, hey, this project, I think should be put on the list and be considered. But there was a lot of thought that was put into this. There's a lot of information to really kind of dig in and see, but hopefully the graphics of things that we have out here today kind of shed some light on some of the things that have been on to date. With that said, I think we'll open it up for a couple quick questions, but if you want to talk project specifics, or say my street needs bike lanes, or I need a new sidewalk, I think we'll save those for breaking out in the groups, in the sessions, and we're going to mark some stuff up, take some notes, gather everybody's feedback, and kind of update this list over the next couple weeks. Yes?
So, without getting too bogged down in the funding process and everything else, can you just briefly describe how you're going to, how the city goes about the funding, getting the funding from the state? Is it you prepare the plans for 100 projects, and you're going to say it's worth $250,000,
right? So we
get to the state, and the state says, well, we'll give you $100,000 this year or something like that, or is it more of a piecemeal type of approach, and whatever the city feels they can afford for design funding a particular year, does that get implemented, and then you go and get funding from the state? I'm just curious about that.
So you'll see at every table there's a spreadsheet. These are kind of in draft format, but these list all the projects that we've considered. There's probably 8 pages, 10 pages here, about 100 different projects, and they have costs associated with each one. Traditionally, I think they would submit these all to DOT.
All 100 projects.
All 100 projects, and then they might be sorted by a rank, which we have identified those criteria, which I mentioned, traffic volumes, right-of-way, things like that, and we tried to rank each project based on what the impact might be. We gave it a score of 0 to 5. If it needed right-of-way, a lot of right-of-way, we gave it a 0. If it didn't need any right-of-way, we gave it a 5, because it could be ready a lot sooner than the one that needs right-of-way. So the goal is to sort these projects into a ranking system, upload it to that, and then DOT will look at the sheet and go, okay, these are your top 20 projects, these are your top 100 projects. They'll be sorted in some order, and they'll come back to they're supposed to come back to the city and say, okay, we're going to give you $200,000. So we don't know if they're going to give $400,000 or if they're going to give, amount less than that. I think it's just a matter of how many applications they get in.
It's $400,000, if I'm not mistaken, for the whole state.
No, for the city.
Per
just for the city.
For
Just for
each
this community?
municipality, but there is.
Okay.
But there is going to be, a state limit of money that they're appropriating for this project, so it's a little bit of a fight to the starting line.
I see, okay.
So they're going to get a bunch of applications in, and then they say, all right, we've got $3.5 million to allocate. So we're going to say, all right, all these communities, everybody's going to get somewhere around a couple $100,000 or what it is. Now I had heard, I think there's a certain percentage of the money that's being assigned to communities that have like low-income environmental justice areas, that sort of thing. So those towns might be put on a higher priority to get a little more money. That's right. And in town, you do have a couple of those areas down by Cotter Street in the back neighborhoods through there. But what essentially happens is DOT will come back and say, okay, you submitted this list, you ranked them. Preliminarily, this is your ranking. Like, okay, we're going to give you, if you were going to get $400,000, tell us which projects you might consider. And I know the things that we've been working with Dan on and with Joe on and Jessica is just trying to develop a list of projects that you get the best bang for your buck. Like, you don't need to spend another $80,000 to do survey, design, whatever, that you can do something very simple to implement, something that's easy to bid as part of one of the paving projects or maintenance projects that the city has ongoing every year, and incorporate as many as those. It's either incorporate a bunch of little projects where we're doing the sidewalk improvements, the rapid flashing beacons or transit stops or other things like that, than to do, say, one project that's, a $400,000 project that just does sidewalks and pavement and that's it. So I think that the approach to see, where the priorities are all through town, not focus just on one area, but try to get the best bang for the buck, without having to do a lot of extra labor.
Is Jessica going to be kind of like the point person from DOT to lobby for as much money as possible?
Well, yes,
Come on, Jessica.
I signed up for the portal, so I actually am in, the point of contact for the city, but I'm not the only one who has access to the portal. So,
Okay.
It really is an engineering call. I see this again from a walkability, sustainability, livability standpoint. These guys are looking at it from the engineering standpoint in terms of what's feasible, what makes sense, and again, what gets most bang for the buck. So between the two of us, the two departments, we can sort of, I think, try to come up with what we think makes the most sense based on a bunch of different factors that's important for us, for our different departments.
What's the deadline for filing?
September.
So September 1 is the next filing deadline for Tier 2, where the spreadsheet gets updated.
Which is what this is. So Tier 1 is the policy which we've adopted.
Yeah.
And has been submitted and accepted by the state, so that's good to go. This is called Tier 2, what we're doing today. And Tier 3 is the funding cycle. So there's the 3 tiers within the Mass DOT program.
And this document can be updated every year. So they make the submission usually in September and April. So sometime between now and April, or next September, the city will, probably go through and say, oh, we paved this street as part of maintenance to this, and update and re-update that sheet and upload it to DOT's website so it gets reconsidered for the next round.
Just for Tier 3, we can choose up to $400,000 worth of projects. It can be one project, it can be 15 projects. That goes in Tier 3 probably sometime in October.
Yep.
And then based on the state reviews those, and then they make their awards.
And the state usually gives you about a year, typically about a year, to implement those projects. So it's another reason why you want to try. You can always ask for an extension, but it's another reason why you want to keep your projects pretty simple, because they do give you kind of a timeline to spend the money.
Can I just ask, before we start breaking out, if there's any terminology or anything in these documents in terms of what explains what the project is? I mean, we talked about sidewalks. You did throw out rapid flashing
Beacons.
So
You are going to make me put my glasses on.
I'm sorry. But I'm just, before we get down
Sure.
into starting about projects, if there's any terminology that people should understand what that means, if they're looking at the list and they say, okay, what is a rapid flashing
Yeah.
beacon?
So-
What does that mean and how does that work?
So the spreadsheets that you see here, and when you see them up there, there's a project name and a project description. And then there's project limits. So the project limits is basically the street name, and then the project name gives you a description of kind of the limit of work, and then there's a project description where we might talk about, there's gonna be a lot of engineering terms, kind of like mill and overlay, where we take off the old pavement, put on new pavement, bike lanes. You might see FDP in there, which is full depth pavement. The rapid flashing beacons, sometimes those might just be referenced in there as RRFB. So those are more kind of the mid-block. You have them out by the school where those are the in-pavement ones. But when you push the button, they flash, and that the strobe lights flash back and forth as you cross like a mid-block crossing is typically where you would see those. You'll see things like sharrows, which if sharrows are basically a bicycle with a couple arrows that just kind of for sharing the road. If you don't have the ability to put a dedicated bike lane, so there'll be bike lanes, and then there's the sharrows, and the sharrows are basically, it's like a bicyclist with like a bunch of arrows and there's signage that goes along with it, and that's basically used on low volume roadways where you can share the road, low speed roadways that you can share the road with vehicles and bicycles if you don't have the room to put the dedicated bike lanes. Some sidewalks, ADA repairs to sidewalks and wheelchair ramps. Can you think of anything else that's...
There might be a tabletop intersection, which is basically just a gently raised crosswalk and kind of some curb bump outs, so that way it kind of brings attention to the crosswalk and it's not just a couple signs, kind of calm traffic.
You might see terms like crosswalk enhancements, and pretty much that means signage, striping, and those kinds of enhancements for a crosswalk of some sort. But that's pretty much, if you have any questions when you go through it, if you're looking at the project list and see anything that doesn't make sense, or just let us know. We're happy to answer that. Yes.
This is a detailed question, but is there a minimum width for sidewalks?
It's kind of a loaded question. Yes, there is. There are exceptions that you can do, but you would tend to look at like 5 feet is ideal.
Yeah, I know there was a new sidewalk in town that I couldn't imagine someone with a baby carriage and a toddler next to them being able to go side by side.
What's the minimum? 38 inches? 36 inches.
Obstruction.
So you got 3 feet around obstruction, and then there's a certain distance you can do 4 feet, and then you have to have a bump out for 5 feet. That's the sort of thing. So there might be applications where if it's less than 3 feet, then it probably doesn't meet ADA. So if you have a spot that is of a concern, I think if we don't already know it, because I know that the city did spend a lot of time going through and inventorying sidewalks and crosswalks as part of another grant that they did a few years back, and we've incorporated that information in as part of this.
Yeah, just to give props to the health department. So that was actually a grant that the health department got to look at walkability and planning. And so we partnered with the health department, and planning department staff went out and did a sidewalk inventory and then compiled all that data into a GIS format with photos, which we've provided to the engineering department, so that if there's ever a complaint on a specific sidewalk, they have the data right there in a GIS format that they can just click on it and look at the picture. So I just wanted to give props to the health department, because they're also involved in walkability and thinking about how we move about our community. So, anything else? Should we break out?
Just we did extra points because we are part of the community compact with the governor's office.
Yeah, there you
Do, yes. I don't know. I don't know if we signed up for complete streets under the community.
It doesn't matter, you still get extra percentages because we have a contract with the governor for the community compact. You are the communities that have signed up for that, which we did. I don't remember when I signed up. It was a year, probably 2 years ago. You also receive extra points on your application
For grant applications.
I'm just thinking, while we're all here, sitting here as a group, would it be helpful to talk about maybe the top 2, 3, 4, 5 ranked projects and kind of explain to us, why they're ranked number 1, and recognize they're going to shuffle around, but it would help to understand the process, the methodology, and how you got through the year, instead of doing it.
Yeah.
I don't think we really rank anything.
If you haven't,
It's not our intention to sit here and rank them tonight, because that's something that we haven't sat down as a group and even dissected that yet. So we're kind of here tonight just to throw this thing at you and say, here's what we got. Are we missing something? If we are, well, let us know. And at some point, yeah, we gotta narrow it down to top 5, top 10, top 20, but not tonight.
But the numbers tonight don't pay attention
They
to
don't,
numbers.
well, they don't lock you in. This is just a list, and we can pick number 1, number 27, and number 4.
Yeah, the number isn't the number isn't the rank.
Right.
It's just a
Project.
number ID. That's all it is. It's
So
completely
will we
meaningless.
have an opportunity to offer our opinion?
Yes.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Tier 3 will be
That's for us here
That won't be.
to advocate for, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah, if you have a project that you think is a top project for you, I think that's very informative for the city to hear, so that if there is an opportunity to get funding to do something, then they know where public input has been received on certain projects.
You have to rank them before you submit them to the state?
Tier 3, we basically put the prioritization plan goes in with all the whole list, and then it's Tier 3, you choose the projects that you want.
So the state,
So the rankings you guys have already created are on a number of criteria, and each of those criteria you rank them 0 to 5 or something?
so when we kind of preliminary did that without public input, but that is just for, like I said, if something is readiness or we're able to do something, we know that a project needs right of way or needs something. So you might come to us and say, this is our number 1 project, and we would probably agree with you, but it might not be on our top list because you need right of way, you need environmental impacts, you need, or permitting and things like that. So we submit the list to DOT, but we have in our mind kind of how these things, might fall from a constructability standpoint. Not a, I guess when I'm talking ranking, it's not a ranking as in these are the prioritized projects, but these are the projects in readiness, like how they can be in a readiness fashion to go out to bid and construct something fairly easily with minimal design and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
Shovel ready, you're looking for shovel ready.
And also, this isn't the only funding available for streets. I mean, we've used community development block grant money to do street infrastructure, so if we have a project that we want to move forward under, or the CDBG grant, and it's on this complete street list, we can put that as part of the grant application saying, hey, this is another reason why this project it should be funded. There's MassWorks funding that funds infrastructure projects, which is what funded all of the mills work behind Pleasant Street Mills. Again, I mean, this isn't the only funding source for these projects. There's lots of other infrastructure funding, and we can use that in those grant applications for those other funding sources because it's in this plan. So don't.
Even our chapter 90, we have, if we're looking to use our chapter 90 on the road, then maybe we can use this on the sidewalks, this type of thing, where we're looking to combine it and get the best bang for our buck. And that's going to affect the priority ranking, depending on how much of our own money we can leverage out, and how much of our own chapter 90 funds, say, or funds from planning, how much we can leverage out with this. So that's going to affect that. So the ranking, to try to rank them here tonight wouldn't mean anything.
All right. 7 o'clock.
oh, yeah, one more.
Oh, one more.
Question. So you talked about having some of the Cottage Street, I assume Union Street things outside the scope of your funding for this. Are any of those projects included in these lists?
Union Street from Payson Avenue to High is listed on in this list as a full project, because we are now in the process of finishing survey and working on design, so that we can go through and have a public hearing through DOT, and we are when I say we, the city's on the tip for 2021.
So the TIP is the Transportation Improvement Program, which is the regional, basically it's the how we fight for transportation dollars in the region. And so every municipality shows up and they advocate for their projects, and we sort of elbow one another and we try to get into this list. And we were able to get Union Street on the 2021 TIP. So it's scheduled for 2021, but that will only happen if our design is complete. And if our design is not complete, then we get kicked. So we are really sort of pushing forward and trying to get our design work done for that project. But as was mentioned, there will be a public hearing specific to that design project for Union Street that will be run by Mass DOT. It is part of the required process for any Mass DOT funding under the TIP.
And there's been huge improvements in the Mass DOT process. As Joe knows, going back, there were years you would have to wait to be on the list for over 25 years, Joe. That wasn't unusual at all.
We've had this intersection out here, I think it was on the list for 10 or 12 years before it finally got done.
And then the West Street ones,
The West
Joe?
Street one was 15 years before that one got
Yeah,
done.
probably.
So, or maybe more than 15
Yeah,
years.
that one was probably,
So, just because you get on this
Yep.
transportation improvement list doesn't mean that
right.
you're gonna roll
So,
along. I
But
mean,
so in other words, they've made huge improvements to the way they do things, and the design was always the cost of the city. And then to get on, the reason you want to get on the DOT list is because they paid for the project. So, the one that we just did up on Glendale and West was a couple of million.
Yeah, it was.
And they pay for that, we pay for the design. So, but like what I'm saying is, we're already on a list for 2021, Jessica, and actually it was 2022, and we were moved up a year, and they go by how ready your project is, which means your design. So that's actually a little bit of good news.
Is Cottage Street included in that or not?
That's, no, we do not have Cottage Street improvements, and I will say that prior to my tenure here, there was community development block grant money that was spent on infrastructure improvements on Cottage Street that went through a very public process for those improvements. So the intersection, the Majestic Theater, the parking lot that was purchased, that was all done with CDBG money. 2002, somewhere around there. And so, under the CDBG rules, they don't want you tearing up projects that they've paid for, right? So there's got to be a certain amount of time before major improvements, I would say, for tearing up things can be done. That doesn't mean that we can't repaint the crosswalk there. That's simple enough. Or improve that in some sort of way. And those projects are actually on the list. So there are some pedestrian safety tweaking that's on Cottage Street, but Cottage Street has already, that infrastructure improvement has already been funded through a grant program not all that long ago.
Not including the pavement of Cottage Street.
It was sidewalk, this is before my time, so it was sidewalks, curb cuts.
No.
It didn't include, did not.
It has not been repaved.
It
right
did
now.
not include paving, but it was sidewalk infrastructure and curbing
Right.
and, anything else? Lighting,
The bump outs, all of
the
that.
bump outs, the lighting,
Design,
the
the
design.
parking lot.
See,
The parking lot, so-
the pavement would most likely fall under our Chapter 90 program. So that's, again, we're looking to tie this in to the Chapter 90 program to get
The match.
a match or the biggest bang for our buck. So we're well aware of the condition of Cottage Street.
Is there any chance
Union.
for interim improvement of the pavement on Union Street until 2021? I mean,
No.
that's gonna be awful.
No, I'll say that straight out, no. We'll patch the holes, that's all we can do. It doesn't make sense to put any sort of an overlay on that right now, because then you'd have to adjust all the structures all over again, and your temporary patch would be $200,000?
And then tear it all
To tear it
up.
all up?
Well, we have policies like that ourselves, Joe.
Right.
If we just do a street, you're not cutting it up to.
For 5 years.
Exactly.
So you said you gathered all this data, like for accidents and everything. Are things like snow impacts and parking also included in looking at sort of designing a complete street?
Snow impact?
Just thinking about like when it comes to plowing and where that snow's gonna go, is any of that sort of considered?
Sure, I mean, a lot of times when we look at improvements for sidewalks, you like to have that grass kind of buffer,
Yeah.
for snow shoulder, for snow storage, or things like that. So those are certainly things that, because we also talked about, with the Chapter 90 program, about coming through and milling and paving a roadway, and then maybe coming through and doing a sidewalk can we get a sidewalk in and get it offset from a curb? And install the sidewalk first and then come through and do the milling and paving later. So that's kind of some of the thought that went into that. If there was a grass belt out there today and was able to do it, then chances are that it would stay there as part of this. A lot of areas, I will tell you that a lot of areas are either constrained by right-of-way, so to widen or to add a sidewalk that would give you that buffer. Because we did look at right-of-way versus the existing cross-section for the pavement and the curb to curb. And a lot of instances, if we were to add a sidewalk, it would literally, like we're talking adding a sidewalk right at the curb. Otherwise, you're acquiring right-of-way for, you know, if it's a half-mile stretch of roadway and there's residences on each side, I mean, you could be 30, 40, 50 or more properties that you might end up, you know, having to acquire. So it is something that we always try to think about, but it's.
And as far as snow, you all know, most of our narrow streets, we have to go pick it up. Regardless of where the sidewalk is, we gotta go get it. You can't stay there 1 or 2 storms, because nobody's gonna get down the road. If somebody parks there, nobody else is getting down the road. You gotta go get it. And we'll continue to do that.
And I think a lot of that falls in kind of the maintenance category. I mean, a lot of, at least in the back of our head as we're preparing this list, you know, thinking about long-term for the city for maintenance, but what does that mean? You're gonna build something, but then it's gonna cost me this to maintain it. It may not be the most desirable improvement. So yeah, it was thought about, yes. Yeah.
Are you going to give a brief description of what each map represents as far as the
You
main
want to do the highlights of each one?
area
Sure.
Here, you want to move it to the front?
that it covers?
Yeah. So there's, as Matt was saying, there was 4 different boards. This is figure 3. But for every map, there are key nodes, towns, schools, police, fire, and those things. And we use those to kind of identify where there's sidewalks today, bikes today, and if there's gaps in between certain things out there today where we can add a sidewalk and complete a gap that gets you to a key node. So that's why a lot of the key nodes are in here, key destination points are on there. This one covers speed limits, so this just maps kind of the speeds on the roadway, which helps us kind of dictate, you know, should we be looking at doing bike lanes if the roads are higher of speed, or sharrows, or kind of what is the demand on certain roadways from a speed perspective. This one over here has existing sidewalks and crosswalk locations. So this one, and this one was prepared in conjunction with the effort that was done with the health department. So you said the health department was part of that. So there was, you know, what are the sidewalks that have adequate width today? What are ones that are 4 feet or less? That are constructed narrow? Which are the ones with obstructions in the middle of the sidewalk that doesn't allow you to ADA to answer your question over here? So that's all mapped, and this is all on a GIS database. So I know the town can go in and click on it and find out what the street is, and that maps all of that. This one over here talks about roadway jurisdiction, who the ownership of the roadway is. It's basically either the city or it's DOT. Mass DOT owns a good stretch of Route 10 in the north. I think from the bridge, West Street Bridge up to Northampton line, and then there's a stretch of Main Street down from Southampton up to South Lane?
South Street.
South Street.
Yeah.
So those are owned by the state. We did look at projects on those corridors just to include them, but they are state owned, and I know the state just maintained and just paved Route 10 through there. So while it was something on the list, we kind of tend to focus a little less on it, because if the state's spending their money on it, there's no reason why the city should spend their money on it. So that's good information there.
Excuse me, and that includes the sidewalks? Includes the sidewalks?
Yes, for DOT. Anything within the right of way is would be DOT. Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. I know where you're going with that. And then we also have ADT, which is the average daily traffic. So this is the amount of traffic that travels on the roadway in 2 directions. So it's anywhere from 0 to 2,000 or up to 15,000 cars a day. And that's, again, going in both directions. So it could be a 50-50 split, just depending on the street. So those are color coded, and as you would expect, Cottage Street 141 is probably the highest corridor there coming through town. We also have information that says all the vehicle crashes that happened from 2010 to 2014. And we put a triangle, basically every incident that we were able to get. And that data is available. The only reason why we looked from 2010 to 2014 is that's what's readily available through Mass DOT, which they obtained from the registry of motor vehicles, which is submitted by the city. And so all these things are little nodes that we're able to extract from that database and put on here. There are a couple spots that are dark purple that are highway safety clusters, is what the DOT calls them. So those are areas where high density of crashes that have been observed, which tend to be hotspots for DOT and really focus on. There is one on Union Street near Liberty that we're right now working with DOT on to figure out if that's a reality. That data goes from 2012 to 2014. So we have to dive into it and get the latest couple years up through 16 for data that's not currently mapped through the GIS system. So that has that on there. The Manhattan Trail is mapped on all of them, so you know where that is. These two boards over here. This is the top board is the environmental. Crosswalks there too. The top board is this board's environmental concerns, so we know if there's any wetland areas, DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, wetlands within the area, anything that we think we might have to do work within an environmental area, so that we know there is a concern that we have to do any of that environmental permitting I talked about earlier. We also put on here roads that have shoulders of 6 feet or more, or that we know have a cross section of 32 feet. And the reason why 32 feet kind of stands out is traditionally when you go to put in bike lanes on a roadway, you have 11-foot lanes and 5-foot shoulders for bike lanes. So that's 5 feet, 11, 11, and 5. That's your 32. Unfortunately, a lot of towns where you have that cross section, you have on-street parking or parking is allowed. So it's kind of hard to just go and restripe it with a bike lane without impacting parking. But it's still, it's information on here that we know that we have. And then with this Tier 2 funding that we ended up getting from DOT to do this phase of the study, we were able to count like 10 or 11 or 12 intersections all throughout town. We focused on counting all of the crossings with the Manhattan Trail, and then we focused on a couple of hotspot intersections just to get the traffic volumes, turning movement counts from an hourly standpoint. So these are peak hour counts from the weekday morning and weekday evening. So I'm talking 7 to 8 a.m. or 4 to 5 p.m. would be generally your commuter highest peak traffic. So these are mapped out here, and then we also counted who's crossing and using the Manhattan Trail. We have a more detailed breakdown of bikes and people walking, that sort of thing. So we get a kind of sense of who's crossing at these at the roadway, so we know what kind of enhancement we might need to do at particular ones. There might be some of the Manhattan Trail crossings that are a lower volume crossing where you might not need to do a significant amount of enhancements, or you might have another one like, well, this one's a lot higher than that one, maybe we need to do something a little different. So we have that information, it's all been mapped, and it'll all be included in a final report that the city will have, and it'll be in a PDF format. And then the last board, which we haven't finalized, but and that's why we're here tonight. But this basically has, and there's 4 different spots, and we can kind of break up groups and haul around, but they correspond with that spreadsheet by project number, and everything's got a number on it, and it's been mapped and geocoded to this particular map, and there's a color. Each color circle is either a bicycle, pedestrian, safety, or a transit improvement. So if you see a color mapped on the board with a number, the color means something, and the number means something, and then more project descriptions on there as well. There's a couple photos and things off to the side that kind of give examples of complete streets types projects, just to kind of, if you want to know what a rapid flashing beacon looks like, you can kind of see what one looks like there. If you want to see what an enhanced crosswalk looks like, or a speed warning sign, or a transit bus stop that the PDTA now uses, there's one there. Sidewalks, lighting, things like that, just to kind of give you a sense for kind of what those improvements might look like visually. But the thought is that we would go through this today. We have some markers, mark these up, and just get feedback from you.
Matt, my suggestion to the group is this, that you break up into groups and look at those maps. I'm sure a lot of you are here with 1 or 2 projects in your head that you think, did they think of this one? Did they think of this one? Look at that map, find it. When you find it, go to this sheet, and you'll see what improvements we were talking about, and the rough amount of money that we're talking that is gonna need to do that project. If you don't see it on there, then let us know so that we can look at that project and possibly get it on this list. So that's the best thing to do, is just take a look. Walk up to the map. You all know in your head where you've seen these problems before. See if we have them. If we don't have them, let us know.
And just to piggyback on that, I guess just to close that out before we break out, but like I said, there's the streets on here. It talks a little bit about the project name, a little more detail about the project description, and then there is a cost, and you'll see a cost that's broken out by complete streets funding or other. And if you start looking at some of that, you might see that we're only requesting money from complete streets, or it might be something where the city's part of their maintenance, Chapter 90 paving program, where we might have put a dollar amount that they have in mind for using Chapter 90, and then piggyback that with the complete streets. So in some instances, there's numbers in both categories. In some instances, it might be just money in the complete streets category. But we went through all 100 projects and kind of preliminarily looked through and said, okay, if this particular roadway we did widening, we did this, what would we need to do? And we did a preliminary cost for each one. So there's been some really good thought that's been put into each project. Not that we just picked this project and threw a number at it. But again, want to get your feedback. The way these dots have been coded have been either at the beginning or end of a project. So if you see a dot at the beginning of at Park Street, but you don't see it in the middle, you may just have to go see the project description, because I just coded it by the project starting point, and it might include all of Park Street. But it would have gotten really busy to try to shade out the whole roadway if it's a 2-mile roadway project. So we put a number to it, and that's usually the starting point.
Is there a suggested way of breaking out? For instance, if I know there are 2 of us here who are extremely interested in bicycling. If there are other people extremely interested in bicycling, perhaps we should cluster at one.
Bicycle table.
Or do you think it's better that we're heterogeneous?
I think that's a great idea.
I don't know. Do you have a preference? I mean,
I don't know, does everybody here want to bike?
Well, if everybody does, then
we're gonna have
that's
50
fine.
people with bikers,
Well, I guess grouping by height might take a
Well,
little.
let's take the bike people out first, and then everybody else can break up.
All right.
I think it's a great idea. So you don't-
So bike advocates over there.
But what if both? Or what if we're bike and walking advocates?
Well, maybe you should say walking.
You
We
may
don't,
join us.
probably around 10 people per.
I am interested in.
Some of us should be with each group. One of us should be with me.